This is your reality check.
Welcome to The Reality Check, your weekly Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. Today is March 17th, and again, it's just me, producer Pat. Everyone is back from holidays. However, the Toronto crew had a kind of catastrophic computer failure, which is stopping us from bringing you a brand new show this week. Instead, this is a mashup of sorts. This is maybe the most controversial interview we've ever done, though that came as a bit of a surprise to us. It resulted in quite a few emails, and even some people went as far as giving us bad reviews on iTunes about this. Why play it again? Well, it's an interesting conversation, and controversies and curiosities is right in the tagline of our show. And with that, this is Darren and Adam's chat with Brian Tomasik about wild animal suffering. This originally aired in 2 parts back in early 2015. We hope you enjoy it.
Today we have speaking with us Brian Tomasik, who is the co-founder of foundationalresearch.org, as well as writes a lot of essays on reducing suffering at utilitarian-essays.com. He's really a very well-rounded, well-read man who's written a lot on a lot of topics, and I wanted to talk to him today because he wrote this very interesting essay about the importance of wild animal suffering. So welcome, Brian Tomasik.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here.
Great. We're glad to have you. So in your essay, you're obviously going to talk about wild animal suffering, but for our listeners, as people who listen to our podcast regularly know, we do talk about animals and the importance of probably not eating them, even though some of us still do. But just as an overview, why should people care about animal suffering at all?
Well, I think caring about animal suffering is a natural extension of caring about suffering in general. Many people think that suffering matters because it's suffering, not because it's suffering of a member of a certain species. So if you take that view, then it's pretty straightforward. We can also make other kinds of arguments about the fact that there's no clear boundary between humans and other animals. I mean, humans are animals themselves. So the question is more, why should we care about suffering by non-human animals? And you can make a lot of different points. One is what Peter Singer has popularized as the argument for marginal cases, which is that there are some humans who may have lower cognitive abilities than animals, for example, infants or mentally disabled adult humans. And we still care about the suffering of those humans, so it's not clear why we wouldn't care about the suffering of animals that have comparable or maybe greater cognitive abilities.
I certainly thought that was an excellent example Singer used in one of his books when I read it, where he said, well, how do you feel about, say, animal research on non-human primates? And you're like, well, maybe it's justified sometimes. Like, well, how about experimenting on a disabled infant? And you're like, well, that sounds terrible. But what's the difference? Well, we say one's human, one's not, but as you said, is that a meaningful distinction? And I think the answer is not really, or no.
Right, and it's a stronger argument for the case of an adult who has no chance of recovery, because at least for the infant you can say, like, the parents care about it and maybe there's some chance it'll recover as it grows old, or but for an adult who has no friends or family, so there's no kind of instrumental external reason that the research would cause harm. We still think it causes harm to the person, him or herself, and so the same is true for animals.
Right, the suffering itself is what matters. Now, typically, the animal rights movement seems to focus a lot, at least in the popular media, on factory farming and issues of that ilk. And do you think that is a valid enterprise? And then how does that contrast with this world of wild animal suffering?
Yeah, that's definitely an important thing to focus on. I think actually many animal rights activists focus on other causes too that may be quantitatively less important, like zoos and circuses and fur farms and things like that, where they certainly matter, and there's a lot of animal suffering going on, but the number of animals affected is smaller than for factory farming. So among the cases where humans directly harm animals, it seems plausible that factory farming ranks at the top. There are at least 10 billion factory farmed animals in the US, and about 60 billion farmed animals in general killed each year. So that's certainly a pretty big issue. And also many of the animals are big and have big brains and are intelligent. So if you weight suffering by the cognitive sophistication of the animals, it becomes a pretty important issue from that respect as well. So I think it's good when animal activists focus on factory farming, but I think that they focus too much on issues where humans are directly causing the harm. There's a tendency in ethics to kind of make your own self pure and focus on what you're doing rather than just look at everything that's happening in the world and try to make that try to improve that.
And do you think that's a natural human tendency because the individual wants to, say, either feel better about themselves or they just really aren't usually thinking in such a broad picture of trying to look at the scope of, say, all suffering, which is what it seems that you try to do?
Right. I think both of those are true. I think ethics in general refers to getting along in a community, and in that regard, ethics is usually about trying to judge your own actions, like what obligations you have, what's right and wrong for yourself. And it's usually not about a global optimization of some agenda. And so there's certainly something to that, because in history, sometimes when people have tried to globally optimize some ideology, it leads to bad outcomes. And there are many cases where trying to look at your own actions is actually a good way to prevent against kind of Machiavellian tendencies. For example, you shouldn't rob a bank to donate to charity because even if you think you're doing the right thing, that could lead to long-term bad consequences for society as a whole.
Yeah,
and
probably.
So I think there are a lot of cases where this intention-based or kind of deontology-inspired ethics does lead to good outcomes. Another reason that it's important is that humans care about the motives of their actors. For example, whether you kill somebody intentionally or accidentally matters a lot for external reasons, because if you're somebody who murders deliberately, then you're more dangerous and you should be locked up. Whereas if you completely accidentally killed somebody, that doesn't imply the same precautions as a result. So the intentions certainly matter a lot, like in a criminal justice context. But when we think about the harm that the victim suffers, especially if the victim is an animal that doesn't understand what's going on in terms of human social relations, then the intentions of the actor don't matter as much. So if you're a human and you're intentionally harmed, you might be much more resentful than if you're accidentally harmed. But if you're an animal, you probably don't understand the motive behind either one. So in the animal case, it seems there's less reason to focus on intentions and more reason to focus on consequences.
Right. It certainly wouldn't matter from the animal's perspective. They're just having harm experienced or being done to them. So you're saying approximately maybe 60 billion animals are in factory farms for humans to eat each year, and there's about 7 billion humans on Earth. But you've also said in this very interesting essay that that's much less than the scale of wild animal suffering. So when we talk about wild animals and their experiences, what's the scale we're using then in terms of numbers?
Just a point of clarification, 60 billion is the total killed each year worldwide, and so that includes non-factory farms in the third world, which could be an appreciable fraction. Regarding the amount of wild animals, there aren't excellent estimates of this. Usually when scientists try to quantify numbers of animals, they look at species, and I haven't found a good comprehensive paper that tries to estimate the actual populations of different species. So I put one together. It's called How Many Wild Animals Are There? And it's very rough because I'm just kind of extrapolating from density estimates on a hectare basis, or even just comparisons of the relative numbers of different classes of animals. So I wouldn't take the figures to be very trustworthy, but maybe within a few orders of magnitude, they're probably accurate. And also the exact number doesn't have much impact because the numbers are so big that a few orders of magnitude would still imply the same sorts of conclusions.
Right. This does sound like maybe a great research project for someone in grad school or somewhere to actually figure this out.
Yeah. Maybe there exists literature that I haven't found. There is a paper trying to estimate the number of birds, and it's called How Many Birds Are There? And they estimate between 200 and 400 billion. And so I haven't seen similar things in the cases of other types of animals, but maybe they exist. The number of insects is also pretty well documented between 10 to the 18th and 10 to the 19th. That's a billion billion, or a billion billion to 10 billion billion.
Wow.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's about a billion insects for every human. And sometimes people think you should weigh numbers of animals by some sort of measure of neural complexity. And I agree with that. I think one insect counts less than one person or even one bird or one mouse. If you quantify it purely in terms of number of neurons, it still turns out that insects have more neurons than humans by between 1 and 3 orders of magnitude.
Wow.
It becomes closer, certainly, if you count number of neurons.
Well, right, because I think humans have, what, it was like 16 billion neurons or something like that. So as long as an insect has 16 neurons.
Yeah, a human has about 85 billion neurons, so we
Okay.
could approximate that as 10 to the 11th. An insect has, say, the smaller insects like fruit flies have about 10 to the 5th neurons. So that's a difference of 6 orders of magnitude.
Right.
Whereas the number difference is 8 or 9 orders of magnitude. So that means insects have at least 100 to 1,000 times more total neurons than
So if all those insects got together, maybe they'd be conscious, as some sketchy theories of emergence say. What about the other types of animals on Earth?
Well, I don't have great figures for this, but based on extrapolation from number of birds, I estimate something like 1 trillion mammals, maybe 1 trillion to 10 trillion reptiles and amphibians, at least 10 trillion fish. And if you go into zooplankton territory, that's maybe even bigger than the number of insects, between 10 to the 18th and 10 to the 21st. And the most numerous animal that I know of is nematodes, which have a population of about 10 to the 22nd. Of course, whether they're conscious is certainly something people can doubt, or how much they matter is something you can doubt. But they're very small. I mean, they're a model organism for studying nervous systems because they have such small brains.
Right. So basically, we're on the order of trillions or hundreds of billions in terms of scale. And anyone who's seen a nature documentary usually knows at least a part where one animal gets horribly eaten or attacked by another. And I assume that's what is of great concern to you.
Right, yeah. So predation is maybe the most visible or salient kind of harm that animals experience. And it can be quite bad. I mean, it's hard to think of something that an animal would go through that's worse per second than having your flesh torn apart. Sometimes predation can last maybe just a minute if the animal is asphyxiated quickly. Sometimes it could last 5 to 10 minutes or even 20 minutes because the predator might eat the internal organs without killing the animal. Like you can think of a snake that swallows its prey, that could take several minutes to be killed. Sometimes prey even escape from a snake's mouth, which shows that they're not immediately killed by the process. Then there are also parasites that can cause more prolonged harm. There's a famous case of the ichneumon wasp that infects caterpillar larvae, and the baby wasps eat the caterpillar from the inside, and they want to preserve the vitality of the flesh so that it doesn't go bad. So they preserve the visceral organs like the heart, or the I don't think caterpillars have hearts the way humans do, but the kind of the circulatory systems and so on, and they eat everything else first, so that the caterpillar stays alive as long as possible. And it's not clear whether the caterpillar suffers in that process. Maybe if it were actually suffering, it would somehow try to fight against the wasp babies. But that kind of thing can happen, and we certainly know on a bigger scale, parasitism can have very prolonged health consequences. And the same thing with disease. So the three that I've listed are a triad that Jeffrey Lockwood calls predation, parasitism, and pathogens. And then there's another P harm that animals suffer, which is physical injury. So that can include just ordinary accidents, like deer may fall off a cliff or injure their legs. It can include harsh weather conditions. For example, birds can freeze under ice if there's an ice storm. There's also hunger and thirst. Animals die of droughts and so on. So there are a lot of ways to die, but every animal is going to die in one of those ways, and most of them are not very pleasant.
Right. It certainly seems like it's hard to imagine an animal dying so-called of old age, like on its own, without something actually eating it because it's old and now weaker or slower.
Right. Yeah. For the most part, that's probably true because the predators go after the weak animals.
What about other predators which aren't necessarily prey to others which would experience dying of old age?
Well, there probably are some. I mean, if you're at the top of the food chain, then you probably aren't going to be eaten except by like parasites or diseases. But their numbers are relatively few. So
Right.
It's certainly plausible that there are some animals that have relatively good lives. And one of the reasons I think humans have relatively good lives is that they're at the top of the food chain. And they can live a long time. So probably like elephants and tigers have pretty good lives because they don't have a lot of relative to other animals, they have relatively low infant mortality. They live a long time. They don't have a lot of predation threats.
Right.
So in that case, which is the case that humans are accustomed to, life might not be so bad relative to if you're at the bottom.
Right. Do you know the comedian Louis C.K.? Have you heard him do a bit about this?
I haven't.
Well, he's basically saying that humans have basically gotten themselves out of the food chain. And isn't that great? Because could you imagine, like, if you were prey, you leave the house to go to the office in the morning, and something immediately starts chasing you all the time. And so that's the silly bit, but there's this truth there. Similarly, like, well, imagine you were the predator. It's like, every time you wanted to eat, you had to chase something that was running for its life. And then you had to bite its neck until it stopped squirming, and then you eat its insides. And just every time you're hungry, you had to do that, and how terrible that would be. Now, that's a bit of a silly statement, but there's some truth there, which is why I want to use that just to segue to the dangers of over or underestimating about how much we can project, say, a human feeling onto these types of suffering. Because when you talked about, a smaller insect or organism having part of their body attacked or insides eaten, if you say it to a human, they very much squirm, but to say it'd be a similar experience seems implausible.
Right. Yeah, I agree that especially for insects and comparable organisms, it's not clear that they suffer in the same ways that humans do. There are other reports of insects having limbs ripped off or having other kinds of physical injury, and they don't seem to signal that there's a problem in the same way that larger animals would. Although I certainly have seen many insects that do seem to show their injury. And insects do have aversive responses to many stimuli like heat and electric shock and cold. And they have to have certain kinds of aversions to survive. They may not be exactly the same as human aversions. But for the larger animals, the similarities are closer. Scientists have shown that there's something called an ecology of fear. When a predator is introduced to an ecosystem, you actually see the deer or whatever the prey is becoming more cautious, and they don't go out into open fields as much. And so their behavior actually changes substantially. And at a physiological level, there seem to be similar processes that go on when animals are afraid of predation. There's studies of post-traumatic stress disorder when people are animal models of post-traumatic stress disorder. When scientists are trying to develop drugs and therapies, they induce post-traumatic stress disorder in mice by exposing them to cats without letting the mice escape. And they've shown that mice show behavioral symptoms comparable to those of humans who have PTSD for up to weeks afterwards. And so it makes sense. Humans and mice are not that far apart in their evolutionary history. And the functions of these kinds of mental processes should be similar in both cases. So especially for the higher mammals, it seems more legitimate to draw the comparisons, although there's always a danger, especially because humans have language and maybe certain higher thoughts that many animals, even many mammals, don't have.
Right, and certainly we do use mice or rats as a lot for experimentation to then use modeling for different types of human studies as well. And I sort of think with these types of arguments, if someone doesn't want to believe insects suffer, which I'm kind of there at the moment, that's one thing, and that you just sort of move up the scale. Like, well, mice, no. Well, how about your cat or your dog? And then most people would say, well, I believe my cat or dog could suffer. And then you're like, well, say a pig or a cow is comparable. So now you're like, well, what about a deer? Is a deer smarter or dumber or can suffer more or less than your cat or your dog? And I think most people would say, well, it might be similar if I really wanted to be honest about it. So I think strategically you could almost like, well, pick the animal wherever you're comfortable saying that definitely suffers. And because the numbers are so high, it's still going to be a problem. I wanted to have you elaborate a bit on just why there is necessarily so much suffering. Because at the moment, if I picture, say, I don't know, a squirrel or something running around trying to find nuts, it doesn't seem like their life is that bad to me. So is there really that much suffering going on?
That's a good point. So it's not as though I'm saying that all of their lives are horrible. In fact, they experience a lot of pleasure the way that humans do. Jonathan Balcombe has written a book called Pleasurable Kingdom, where he documents the kinds of joys that wild animals experience. But there are some systematic differences from human lives that make me more pessimistic about the net balance of wild animal experiences, which is so one of them we talked about already, that humans are at the top of the food chain. And so they have less fear of predators and also longer lives. In general, humans, even in the prehistoric days, humans lived a few decades on average, which is much better than most animals. Most animals, well, even if you're talking about mammals, most mammals that survive to adulthood only live a few years, maybe a few decades if they're bigger. And then the survive to adulthood part is key because most animals produce large numbers of offspring, most of which die shortly after birth. Humans have, in the Middle Ages, for example, human infant mortality was maybe 50%, but for a lot of animals like rats or chipmunks or whatever, it might be 90%, 95%, something like that. In the sense that the mothers produce 5, 10, 20 offspring, and then on average at most 2 children can survive from each parent in a stable population, where the 2 parents get replaced by two children. So that's a systematic difference. It's something that is called R selection in ecology, where the organism focuses more on the number of offspring rather than the quality of the offspring. So you spend less time parenting for each offspring, and you just kind of produce a lot and hope that a few of them survive. And in the invertebrate case, or in the lower animals, it's even worse. Insects might produce hundreds of offspring. Fish produce thousands or tens of thousands of eggs. And of course, it's not that most of those eggs may be eaten before they hatch or die shortly after hatching. So they're not nearly as complex as a full-grown adult at that point. And that somewhat offsets the amount of pain that's involved. But an appreciable fraction of them do survive to longer, such that their brains are more complicated by the time they suffer. And so even if you thought that animal lives were good until death, and then death is painful, that would still imply a pretty pessimistic outlook, because so many animals die so soon after being born. If the adult life expectancies are only a few years, then if you factor in 90% infant mortality, the life expectancy for any given animal would be on the order of months, or in the case of insects, maybe even days. So that's sort of not a great ratio. You live a few days or a few months and then have a very painful death due to predation or disease or whatever. That alone would lead to a lot of suffering, maybe I think a net balance of suffering, even if the rest of their lives were cheerful.
That's certainly the interesting equation, that depending on who you are, you might then think, well, how many months of, say, normal animal existence is going to be worthwhile to exist for between 5 minutes and, say, several hours of extreme suffering at the end of it?
Right.
certainly at least humans with our peak end rule, if the end of something is bad, you experience the whole thing as terrible. But here it's a bit odd because the end is your death, so it's not like you can have your after death looking back at your terrible death itself.
Yeah.
I guess intuitively I can't. At the moment I feel that animals move around and they'll experience some stressors, like as you're saying, when different organisms are introduced to different predators. But of course that's the evolutionary design, so that they don't actually get attacked, and because they're putting in mechanisms or engaging in certain behaviors to make it less likely to be prey. But it doesn't seem so bad. But then there's a different intuition, which is that all the time you're making sure you don't get eaten, and that seems terrible.
An animal needs a stress to be able to like survive, right? It's constant pain in a way.
Right. There's the hedonic treadmill, which we might think helps to offset the badness of any given hardship that animals experience. I mean, this relates to the fact that people say those in the third world might be as happy as those in the first world. So I'm not sure if that's true. I mean, there are some studies showing that happiness increases with income up to, say, $10,000 a year. And like, it's hard to argue that people in the Middle Ages were as happy as we are now, although maybe you can't just make that judgment intuitively, because you have a certain hedonic expectations that a medieval peasant wouldn't have.
No, the calculations are so difficult to do because of your complete expectation of what your world is. Mm-hmm. And then if things are... Usually I think that life is often about expectation management. That if you have a certain frame of expectations, you can end up a lot happier than if you had a different set. And as you're indicating, if you're in the Middle Ages, it's not like if you came upon a dirty, flushable toilet, you'd be as displeased as we are now. You'd be like, oh my god, this is magic.
Right, yeah. But the flip side is the hedonic treadmill is not absolute, because there are, like, depression. Some people may be permanently depressed, for example. Some people have an extremely high set point. So there are cases where happiness is not always relative to your past states. And it could be, in the case of being afraid of predators, for example, that could be systematically worse than not being afraid of predators, because like suffering, this gets to the question of what's the difference between suffering and happiness, because both are forms of emotions that motivate you to do something. And one possibility is that suffering is an attempt to avoid, and happiness is or at least kind of a brain change that inclines you to seek. And so predation would be always about, fear of predation would be always about trying to avoid something. And so that could be negative by its nature. It's hard to imagine that, or it doesn't necessarily make sense that trying to avoid predators would ever be an enjoyable experience. It's possible it could be. Like there are cases, for example, hunger, where you both have a negative experience of being hungry and a positive experience of eating, and the motivation comes from both of those parts. But there are some things that are like always bad, and some things that are seemingly always good or neutral, and they seem to be cases where you're trying to always avoid something or always seek something. So it's very hard to nail this down, and we'd have to think more about it to decide where we want to set the threshold of negative versus positive experiences. But that's just some points to suggest that it's not always going to come out to zero for any organism.
Right. So as a sort of a general recap at this point, we've sort of started with the idea that suffering itself matters, which is kind of hard to argue against. Animal suffering also matters. As you pointed out, humans are also animals, so it's just a different type of animal, that non-human animal we're talking about. There are many more wild animals than there are domesticated or animals that are factory farmed, and not all of their lives are good, and maybe even you think some of them on balance are negative in terms of suffering. If this is the case, these hundreds of billions or trillions and trillions of wild animals of different types are suffering like this, is there anything humans could actually do about it?
There are several, although it's not always going to be obvious. The most common response from those who are otherwise sympathetic to animal suffering is that there's nothing we can do about it. So it might be that wild animal suffering dominates in magnitude over all other kinds of animal suffering in just its sheer quantity, but the relevant question is how much can we reduce by our actions, not how much there is in total. Usually how much there is in total correlates with how much you can reduce it, but that's not always the case. So just from the sheer number of wild animals, it doesn't automatically follow that wild animal suffering is the most important action relevant issue. But I think there are many cases where we can in fact have an impact. I mean, it's not the case that humans do nothing to affect wild animals, because we're doing that all the time, every day, through our environmental policies and choices. So one thing that we could do is study in greater depth how the policies that we already undertake are affecting wild animals, and also how we could change them to make the situation better. And there are some animal organizations that look into this. I mean, there are a lot of wildlife groups and things, but I think from my perspective, they take the wrong approach, because they tend to assume that wild animal lives are good and therefore we should try to preserve them as much as possible. And if their assumption is wrong, then what they're doing might be actually harmful rather than positive. So given that I think there's a lot of suffering in nature, it's quite plausible that, say, having a development park implies less suffering, at least in the short term, than what would have been there instead. And so it's possible that a lot of animal organizations that focus on wild animals at all are doing it in the wrong way. And some wildlife groups also don't seem to care so much about the suffering as they do about other values. So there are actually several different organizations whose entire goal is to restore predators or oppose the removal of predators from certain areas in the US or in Europe. And usually they do it just because they think of predators as majestic, or they do rightly recognize that people are harming the predators themselves. For example, if predators are hunted to make it safer for livestock to graze in some area, the wildlife specialists who kill the predators do actually cause them harm and cause them pain. But what these groups ignore is the harm and pain that those predators caused to many, many wildlife. Each predator eats many prey in its lifetime.
It is interesting how we sort of have these mental categories of what counts in one domain and what counts in another. So there's many people who'd be very concerned by, say, a human mistreating a dog or a bird or a cat. And then these same people might actually thinking, we should introduce this predator because it's important. We don't want that particular predator to not have a flourishing life, and then not sort of add up all the suffering that's going to be accounted for that. It's sort of the same way that people are happy to have dogs and cats as pets, and then they like to eat other similarly capable organisms.
Right. And if a predator were eating a human, we wouldn't say that's natural, and we also wouldn't say that's a way to control environmental damage. I mean, often people argue for predators because, for example, in Yellowstone, when predators were removed, the prey overconsumed the plants, and then there was less vegetation. But humans are overconsuming plants and causing vastly more environmental damage than the deer and herbivores in Yellowstone did. But we don't favor predators eating humans to reduce the environmental damage that humans cause. And the environmental damage that herbivores cause may actually not be bad anyway if you think that wildlife suffers more than it enjoys its existence, because the herbivores may have relatively long and good lives, whereas the food that they're eating would otherwise have been eaten by smaller animals, maybe insects, maybe like smaller mice and so on. So having deer eat a lot of plants might not be bad when all things are considered, because the deer are longer lived. They may have they have less infant mortality and have better lives overall. So those are the kinds of questions that we can ask. The first thing to do with wild animal suffering is to think more about it, basically, and raise concern about the issue, study it more, try to collect more insights. There's a whole field of ecology and conservation biology, and there are many, many insights about how ecosystems work, and all this knowledge could be applied to the welfare of the animals rather than just their survival dynamics and population trends and so on. And so there's a vast field of welfare biology, as Yu Kwang Eng calls it, that's waiting to be done. Just kind of taking the ecology that we already know and finding out its implications for happiness and suffering. Yeah, so that's the more immediate term thing that we can do. And then I would say there's one other thing that I think is important, which is I mentioned spreading concern for wild animals, and that matters because humans in the future will have vastly greater ability to affect wild animals than humans in the present do when we have artificial intelligence and nanotechnology and things like that. And I'm not suggesting that we should advance technology faster to get to that point, because I think technology can be very dangerous for other reasons. But when the technology comes, it's important that humans use it well. So having more people care about wild animal suffering in the same way that we today care about malaria or Ebola, to use a current example. Ebola is a form of natural suffering that we think should not happen. So if that same sort of idea were applied more broadly, then there's a greater chance that humans would use technologies in a positive way, and also that they wouldn't inadvertently cause vastly more wild animal suffering. So there are some speculative future scenarios that could happen that would actually multiply the amount of animal suffering many times what's currently on Earth. One of them is called terraforming, which is the idea of converting another planet like Mars to more Earth-like conditions by introducing plants so that they can create oxygen, and then eventually you can bring in animals. And so there are doubts about whether terraforming is possible, but in general, that kind of idea of spreading wildlife to other planets to improve habitability would multiply animal suffering. And a lot of times people involved in space colonization think about it as an engineering challenge, but don't think about the lives of the animals that are actually involved in the process. A related proposal is called directed panspermia, where people would spread, rather than actively cultivating good conditions on a single planet, people would spread the seeds of life to many other planets. And the hope is that some of them would take root on planets that happen to be suitable enough for life. Some people say that we have a moral imperative to spread life because the purpose of life is to spread itself, and life is inherently valuable, and so we should produce as much of it as we can. And again, these ignore the suffering that the life actually has to experience. And then one more possible way in which humans could multiply wild animal suffering is in simulations. If they create digital simulations of wildlife that are accurate enough to actually be sentient, then that could suffer in the same way that ordinary wildlife does. We can hope that people would engineer the simulations to maybe avoid the suffering. So when a prey is about to be eaten, maybe you switch off its aversion subroutines. So there's room to make the simulations more humane, but we have to care about wild animals in the first place before people are going to ask those kinds of questions.
Right. I think you've made a series of excellent points, especially the idea that we have to study this a lot more. And certainly, at least when you're talking to individuals, there is a difference between admitting that there is a problem and then whether you can do anything about it. And I think sometimes people, almost subconsciously, because they think it's too big or they feel there's futility, then they don't want to believe there is a problem. And then I guess if you move up the rung of acceptance, like, well, there is a problem, but we can't do anything about it, then there is a problem, maybe we can do something about it. And I think you outlined a lot of different interesting issues. For me, I was thinking, is there a tactical issue here? Is that at the moment it seems like more people are becoming more aware of animal suffering and factory farming and stuff like that, but I'm not sure if people are ready to leap to the idea of wild animal suffering, because there's always this naturalistic fallacy that seems to pervade a lot of people. And will the idea of reducing factory farming be inadvertently harmed by focusing on what some people might see as, well, preposterous, for lack of a better word?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll go back to something else you said and then come to that point. So about the seeming helplessness. So I have called this learned helplessness, or a kind of learned helplessness in the domain of wild animal suffering, where, so if you're a person in the Middle Ages, there's very little you can do about wild animal suffering on a large scale since you don't have technology. So what you do is try to cope with the problem and say it's God's will, or it's due to the sins of Adam and Eve, or it's the natural order and it should be that way. And so as a psychological strategy for making yourself feel better, you say that's the way it should be because I can't change it. And so that's sort of a way to cope with the problem. Then later on, if it does become possible to change the situation, if you take your original excuse too seriously, you might still think you shouldn't fix it, even though now you can. So that's why I called it kind of learned helplessness. Originally, you couldn't do anything about it. Now, if you can, you still don't do anything about it. And we see this in other areas too, like a classic case is trying to end aging. Aubrey de Grey has raised this point where people say aging is good because of various reasons. It reduces overpopulation, or it death gives meaning to life. We wouldn't value life if we could live for a long time, things like that. And people take those excuses so literally that originally they maybe invented those excuses as a way to come to terms with the inevitable. And now if it's no longer inevitable, they still sometimes believe it so much that they don't try to change things. So there's something similar in the case of wild animal suffering. It's now becoming potentially conceivable that in the future we could do something about it on a larger scale, but people take their original excuses too seriously and still don't think there needs to be something done because they've created this ideology of the way the natural order should work and so on.
Right.
It's interesting that a lot of the original discussion of wild animal suffering was in the context of the problem of evil, because in the past, the only person who could conceivably do something about wild animal suffering was God, because humans were too feckless to be able to have a large-scale impact. Now that humans might actually be in a position, we are going to be more in the position of God to decide these questions. So it may become the human problem of evil. Why are humans permitting this suffering to continue when they could stop it? And that's especially salient in the case of spreading animal life to space, because we are the ones who are making the decision to create more life. So the problem of evil is especially applicable to us in that context.
Right.
So as far as your question, is it too radical and will it turn people away to talk about this? It's an important concern. And I think it's good to focus on different audiences with different messages. I wouldn't talk too much about wild animal suffering with somebody who doesn't even think animals matter, because, as you say, you probably have to go in stages. And wild animal suffering is often used as a reductio ad absurdum against caring about animals in general. It's sometimes taken as an argument against vegetarianism. People say lions eat gazelles, so it's okay for humans to eat their own prey. And if it's wrong for humans to eat their own prey, isn't it wrong for lions to eat gazelles too? But that's absurd, so vegetarianism must not be required. So one man's modus tollens is another's modus ponens, and the wild animal suffering argument is saying, yeah, it's bad when lions eat gazelles too. But since that's usually used as reductio, that shows that it's a very radical conclusion. So I think wild animal suffering is best discussed among animal advocates who already care about animals, maybe among transhumanists or kind of people who are interested in technology for whom the idea is not radical in the first place. In fact, a lot of the interest in wild animal suffering came from transhumanists like David Pearce, who contemplate that it might actually be possible to do something about wild animal suffering, even though we can also do things through more ordinary research like ecology and studying the impacts that we're already having, even without advanced technology. And then also just open-minded people in general, like academics and effective altruists and others who are not as scared of strange ideas.
It's very important to know your audience. So as a quick note to the listeners of our show, we're trusting you by the honor system to not misuse this information against nice people who are having decent arguments about the pros or cons about eating animals or animal welfare in general. So Great power, great responsibility. Unfortunately, we seem to be out of time. So, Brian, thank you so much for talking to us today about wild animal suffering.
It was a great pleasure.
If someone wanted to explore more, where should they go?
I've written several essays on the topic on my website, utilitarian-essays.com. There have been several other authors who have talked about this issue too. One is Oscar Orta. He's a professor of philosophy. He's written about natural disvalue and the harm of predation and things like that. David Pearce is another philosopher who has written about the problem of wild animal suffering and the possibility of changing nature for the better. There are lots of other authors that you can find. Oscar Orta has a bibliography of different papers that have been written on this topic. And there's a Facebook group called Reducing Wild Animal Suffering that you can search for, where we talk about these things on a daily basis.
Great. Well, thanks again for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, there you have it. That's this week's show. We hope you enjoyed it. If you didn't, please, no bad reviews on iTunes. We will get our computer woes sorted out and be back with a brand new show next week. Until then, think better to act better. Peace out, cuboids. Stay classy, not spartassy. And we'll talk to you next week.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter @TRC_podcast.